Last time, we discussed the need for a statewide passenger rail network here in Utah, and then we went on a tour of the busiest portion, the Wasatch Corridor, from Provo through Salt Lake City, Ogden, and Brigham City, and then over to Logan. Today, let's go to Moab. Moab is the largest city in Grange County in southeastern Utah. Though its permanent population is tiny, just over 5,000 residents, the city is an international destination for outdoor recreation. The Red Rocks, the Colorado River, and Arches National Park draw millions of visitors from around the world, with a significant portion of these arriving in Utah at the Salt Lake City International Airport. This makes for a surprisingly busy travel corridor. For example, if just 10% of the 1.8 million annual visitors to Arches National Park arrived by train, rail ridership would be, on average, 500 riders per day in both directions, placing the route between two other successful state-supported Amtrak routes, the Pierre Marquette out of Chicago and the Vermonter out of New York City. If Moab isn't enough of a traffic generator, some proponents have identified Grand Junction, Colorado, as a secondary source of ridership. Grand Junction is the largest city in Mesa County, Colorado, with a permanent population of over 70,000, and is home to a respectable tourism industry all of its own. For rail fans and history buffs, the Amtrak station in Grand Junction is the only other train station designed by architect Henry Schlacks, the designer of the Rio Grande Depot in Salt Lake City. However, Grand Junction is over 100 miles away from Moab, both by road and by rail, and, being in a different state, a direct rail connection would require a more complicated funding and revenue-sharing agreement than a single state-supported route. For the remainder of this video, I'm going to confine my plans to the state of Utah. However, considering recent developments of passenger rail in the state of Colorado, the possibility of Grand Junction shouldn't be ruled out so easily. For rail service to Moab, I added a little more detail to our Utah-specific Arrow train set. First is this car, which is a combination baggage and crew area car. The baggage section able to handle large items, such as suitcases, backpacks, camping gear, and mountain bikes, while the crew area would provide the onboard staff with the personal space needed for longer trips. More on that when we discuss travel times. Next, there are 3 standard coaches, each with their own restrooms. And at the end, there is this combination cab car, premium class seating, and food services car. In total, this would provide around 210 seats per train set, or the equivalent of 2 Boeing 737 aircraft, except with a fraction of the pollution produced on such a short route like this. Speaking of airplanes, one of the 3 options to reach Moab from Salt Lake City today is through the air. The nearest airport is the Canyonlands Fields Airport, a tiny airstrip heavily subsidized by the Essential Air Services Program, which is the name given to the hundreds of millions of dollars the federal government pays every year to small, rural airports that it deems to be essential. Despite these subsidies, commercial services to Salt Lake City are only offered during peak summer months, and they never accept mountain bikes as carry-ons. Besides flying, you can also take a 4.5-hour bus ride via Greyhound or Salt Lake Express, either of which will cost you about $70 one way, not counting baggage fees. Or, lastly, you can somehow get a car and drive it to Moab yourself in about 4 hours, but you'll have to take US Highway 6 over Soldier Summit, which has been named one of the deadliest highways in America, and which routinely kills about a dozen people per year while injuring many, many more. What about the train? Amtrak also runs over Soldier Summit already, and can take you as far as Green River. However, the train leaves Salt Lake City only once per day, at 3:20 in the morning. Then, once you arrive in Green River at 5:58 in the morning, you'll have to walk just over a mile to catch the bus on the exact opposite side of town for the remaining hour-and-a-half ride the rest of the way to Moab. Interestingly, this option costs about half as much as the direct bus, since the train tickets are generally cheaper than bus tickets. And I say generally because the other option to get to Moab by train is the luxury land cruise called the Rocky Mountaineer, which departs not from Salt Lake City, but from Denver. This trip takes a day and a half with a luxury hotel stay in Glenwood Springs and costs nearly $2,000 per person at a minimum. I'll only mention that train once more in this video since I don't consider it to be transportation. However, the presence of the existing Amtrak service makes it significantly simpler to add more service to the same line. It also makes my job of tour guide that much easier, since we already know what the travel times will be for a significant portion of the route. The current California Zephyr offers only a small taste of how statewide passenger trains can connect all parts of Utah. As the Wasatch Front continues to grow, it is critical that we continue to build links with the surrounding communities so that the economic benefits of this growth can spread to all the residents of our state. The center of this statewide rail network is Salt Lake City, where I and other Via Rio Grande volunteers have been working hard to realize the Rio Grande Plan, which would not only grade separate all the railroad crossings through downtown Salt Lake City, but would also open at least 50 acres of land to be redeveloped for housing or other good uses, while at the same time returning the beautiful and historic Rio Grande Depot to its rightful place as the central transit station for Salt Lake City, the state of Utah, and the Mountain West. No other building is as well positioned politically, historically, and geographically to serve as the hub in such an important role. Our tour will begin 44 miles to the south, in the city of Provo. Here, passengers will be able to board UTA commuter trains, both routes of our state-supported trains, and eventually 3 long-distance trains to places such as Denver, Cheyenne, Boise, Reno, San Francisco, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. Such an important junction deserves to have a well-functioning and modern train station, such as what we discussed last time. Heading south from Provo, we will run on the former Rio Grande Main Line for 167 miles, until we reach Crescent Junction. This first section, from Provo to Helper, is 75 miles in length and will take us 2 hours and 2 minutes. Unlike the Wasatch Corridor, where I gave 2 different travel time estimates based on existing and raised average speeds, this time we will stick to the existing schedule, since there is little we can do to raise speeds here in the mountains. There are many good and wild ideas for far future speed improvements, 2 of which I will highlight momentarily, but for now I will assume no improvements on the current schedule. Besides, this route is one of the most famous in the world for its stunning and varied scenery, beginning here in the narrows of Spanish Fork Canyon. A notable landmark are the twin tunnels at Thistle, to pass the site of the famous 1983 landslides that blocked the canyon for weeks and destroyed the adjacent town in what was one of the most expensive natural disasters in U.S. history. Since leaving Provo, this entire section of track, called the Provo Subdivision, has been fully double-tracked, with one track being owned by the Union Pacific Railroad and the other by the Utah Railway. In practice, both tracks are used by both companies, with crossovers between the 2 tracks occurring on average every 11 miles. Further east, we pass a significant work in railroad engineering. These hairpin curves and switchbacks, called the Galilee loops, were added in 1913 to flatten the grades from 4% down to 2%. For rail passengers, they provide pristine views down into Spanish Fork Canyon from both sides of the train. If we assume that a significant share of passengers headed to Moab will be tourists, at least initially, then these sorts of attractions are exactly the sort of experiences that they will want. After cresting Soldier Summit at 7,477 feet above sea level, we pass by the future junction of the proposed Uinta Basin Railway, which will head off to the northeast and climb up even higher into the Uinta Basin oil fields. It is possible that this route could be the beginning of a future passenger rail line from the Wasatch Front to Vernal, but since so much is still undecided about that project, I'll only mention it this once. Our next scenic highlight is Castle Gate, where the tracks twist and turn beside the Price River, cutting through tunnels, skirting cliffs and rapids, and passing by the location of a famous daylight train robbery by none other than Butch Cassidy himself. And even though half of Castle Gate was since demolished to make way for U.S. Highway 6, the remaining scenery is still very impressive from the bottom of the winding Price River Canyon. Helper is our first stop since leaving Provo. It is the least used Amtrak station in Utah and will likely remain that way. However, the station and the city have historic significance to Carbon County and could be the host for a future scenic rail line, but more on that in a future video. Moving south from Helper, the double track comes to an end as we enter the Green River subdivision, and we only make it 7.5 miles before we stop again at the city of Price. Price is the largest city in Carbon County, placed right between the smaller cities of Helper and Wellington, and it is home to Utah State University's Eastern Utah campus. In a perfect world, we would limit our stops in Carbon County to just one of these cities, but since travel options are limited, and since we are not as rushed for time as in the last segment, I am perfectly happy to allow this tight station spacing. But I do draw the line at 2. Continuing east, we fly right through Wellington without a second thought. Sorry, Wellington. Beyond Wellington, the tracks of the former Denver and Rio Grande route stay close to the Price River. The highway, meanwhile, heads uphill, closer to the famous Book Cliffs, where the alignment is steeper but straighter. While the railroad twists and turns, sometimes slowing to as little as 45 miles per hour, the highway is mostly straight, and grades stay mostly below 4%, which is impossibly steep for freight trains, but is perfectly acceptable for passenger trains. In engineering terms, between Wellington and Green River, the railroad grinds through 1,850 degrees of curvature, enough to make for 5 complete circles. Meanwhile, the highway curves a total of only 213 degrees, not even enough for 2/3 of one circle. It is little wonder then that travel times from Provo to Green River are 100 minutes faster by car. As I keep saying, this should not be considered a barrier to beginning passenger rail service now. However, here there is a real opportunity to preserve right-of-way for a future, faster passenger rail alignment. It is no secret that UDOT has long-term plans to upgrade Highway 6 to full freeway standards, including multiple lanes, grade separations, and upgrading intersections to interchanges. This is a good idea because, as I said before, this road is disproportionately dangerous compared to other equally trafficked highways that do have freeway-style safety features. However, if all that public money is going to be spent on roads, I say that some of it ought to be spent on trains as well. The section between Wellington and Green River is the best example of what can be done. By including a space for a fast railroad right-of-way, either in the future median or off to the side, it would be possible to create a sealed, passenger-only cutoff with speeds of up to 125 miles per hour. Carrying this through the entire 50 miles between these two cities would cut about 45 minutes off the current rail travel time, which is a significant time savings. Another location that could similarly benefit is the aforementioned Gilloli Loops in Spanish Fork Canyon. Here, the original, steeper railroad right-of-way was repurposed into the current highway alignment. You can still see exactly where the right-of-ways meet, since the grading is still there. Creating a passenger cutoff here to match the future freeway would cut 4.5 miles from the route, as well as upgrade 9 route miles from 30 miles per hour to at least 60 miles per hour. This would save just over 15 minutes of travel time, meaning that these two projects combined could cut about an hour out of the trip, and I'm sure there are other sites that could similarly benefit. But again, unless these projects are associated with the adjacent future roadway upgrades, and the larger budgets generously given to roadway projects, there isn't a good way to justify the costs. So, for now, as we arrive in Green River, our travel times will look like this, with a trip from Salt Lake City taking just over 4 hours. By car, such a trip takes 2 hours and 50 minutes. Continuing east from Green River, we traverse 21 miles of pure single track, without any sidings, before we reach Crescent Junction. These miles run more or less parallel to the existing I-70, not the upgradable US Highway 6, which means that, no matter how tempting it is to consider alternative alignments parallel to the road, or even along the old US 6 grade, I will refrain. Speeds through here are generally high enough anyway, at 70 miles per hour. Crescent Junction is where the Cane Creek branch joins the Green River subdivision. Besides an old gas station, there is literally nothing here worth stopping for. Historically, a station did exist about 2 miles east of here, at Thompson Springs, so that through trains, such as the California and Rio Grande Zephyrs, could connect to buses down to what was then Arches National Monument. For that reason, it may be worthwhile to have a minimal platform here with a connecting rail shuttle so that passengers from Amtrak's current and future long-distance trains can connect directly to Moab without backtracking. And maybe that could go here, behind the gas station. But even so, it doesn't make much sense for a statewide trains to make regular stops here, so I'll list it as a flag stop, triggered by a request button on the platform or via an app, similar to Cache Junction in the last video. What is absolutely necessary, however, is a third leg to the rail junction so that our statewide trains can switch directly onto the Cane Creek branch without reversing. This curve will have to be built to a tight and low-speed radius in order to fit under the existing bridges of I-70. The Cane Creek branch is a surprisingly new line, finished in the 1960s, which means its geometry would allow for much faster speeds than may be expected, with one significant exception for the curves in the area near the airport. The track maintenance is another issue, as current rail traffic is extremely low, with only a few trains per week venturing down to Moab. By adding multiple daily state-supported passenger trains to the line, the Cane Creek branch would become primarily a passenger route, so it makes sense to me that the state of Utah should eventually purchase the route, or at least the northern 27 miles, and upgrade the track to allow for speeds of up to 110 miles per hour. Otherwise, we will be stuck with the status quo of a mere 30 miles per hour. The only other trains to use this branch in 2025 are local freight trains, servicing either the Intrepid Potash Mine or the Uranium Mill cleanup area. During the summer, this is also the route of the aforementioned Rocky Mountaineer cruise train, which arrives from Denver in the east. But even that train doesn't actually make it all the way into Moab, because the tracks themselves do not reach Moab proper. Instead, just before crossing the Colorado River into the city, the tracks stay up high on the cliffs and enter the Bootlegger Tunnel, headed south towards the potash mine. This has left us with a situation very similar to last time, where we had to figure out where we could add a passenger terminal in Logan. For Moab, some people have pitched the idea of a new bridge across the Colorado River to bring passenger trains all the way into the city of Moab, stopping on the north end of Main Street. Others have shied away from the cost and bureaucracy of a bridge and suggested the line end at the airport, which is a whopping 17 miles outside of town. Still others have advocated for the environmental cleanup area, up high on the cliffs. As with Logan, my own proposal should be viewed as a humble suggestion, especially since my proposal relies heavily on a future transit system in Moab that does not yet exist. First, we need to have a look at the location of the main attraction, Arches National Park. It is located across the river and about 4 miles out of town. The layout of the park looks like a tree, with 3 branches connecting the various attractions to the main entrance. This branching layout is one of the reasons that the park can become so congested with cars during the peak season, and it also dictates the shape of the solution. A shuttle bus network within the park would necessarily look like this, with 3 lines all diverging from the park's main entrance. These buses would be very similar to the shuttle buses already operating in Zion National Park on the other side of Utah. While this is an old idea without much tangible progress, the rising and record-breaking number of visitors to the park will almost certainly force the park to take action on it soon. While many visitors will certainly grumble at this development, it is worth asking park visitors to consider how we want to use the limited space within our national parks. Do we want every trailhead to have a Walmart-sized parking lot? Or can we come up with a better, less impactful, and shared solution? Like the shuttles at Zion National Park, a separate, out-of-park shuttle will be needed to bring people from the city to the park's main entrance. In Zion, city shuttle riders are dropped off here, where they then enter the park by crossing a footbridge and walking 1,000 feet along an educational trail that helps establish the tone for the rest of the visitor center and the national park. As a former Disney employee myself, I love the place setting this entrance creates. It is a much more memorable way to enter the national park, rather than waiting in traffic to pay a ranger sitting in a toll booth. In Moab, the city shuttle could meet up with the 3 in-park shuttles at the existing visitor center. Or they could meet up here, just below the existing railroad tracks. This is my preferred site for the Moab Passenger Rail Station. It is high up on a cliff, so an outdoor elevator or even a funicular line would be needed to connect the rail platform with the rest of the transit center. The St. Regis funicular in Park City is a good example and is actually longer than what we'll need in Moab. But once passengers are down at pavement level, they would be able to either catch the city shuttle directly to Main Street in Moab, or they could cross a new 600-foot-long pedestrian bridge over Highway 191 and the Dry Creek, ending at the Arches National Park Visitor Center, where the 3 shuttle routes will be waiting to take visitors directly to see the natural wonders. The bridge, as I imagine it, should be extra wide and disguised in natural materials, similar to a wildlife crossing, to make for an excellent and natural first impression to visitors from around the world. When I'm feeling ambitious, I also include one more line on this map, because the tracks keep on going beyond the station. Within the next 7 miles, the tracks pass through the Bootlegger Tunnel, the Corona Arch, the Day Canyon Trailhead, and the Jug Handle Arch Trailhead, all of which could be connected by a short, multiple-unit shuttle train running back and forth all day. But rather than get distracted by side projects, it is enough to say that, despite this odd choice of location, a train station here would be extremely well connected to the popular attractions of Moab. Let's check our travel time. Supposing no upgrades south of Provo, except for improved track maintenance for the Cane Creek branch, the trip from Salt Lake City to Moab will take a total of 4 hours and 49 minutes. Without traffic or weather, this same trip by car will take approximately 3.5 hours, or 80 minutes faster. Most of that discrepancy could be evened out eventually with future passenger-only tracks, as I discussed earlier. But those are far out in the future, and we shouldn't make this project rely on them. As things stand, the entire trip from Logan through Salt Lake City and down to Moab would take 6 hours and 33 minutes, assuming a 60-mile-per-hour average speed north of Provo. If we can keep layover times at the terminals to half an hour, which would require trains to run a strict schedule, we have a total one-way travel time of 7 hours, meaning a round trip would take 14 hours. That is a long time for a crew to be on duty. In fact, by law, a train operator can only work for 12 hours before needing at least 10 hours of break. Now, there are smart ways to schedule this, with crews transferring from one train to another as they meet, so that each crew runs only half of a round trip. The obvious place for a transfer would be in Provo, since a round trip from Provo to Moab and back would take only 8.5 hours, while the trip from Provo to Logan and back would take 5.5 hours. Better yet, if we assume an 80-mile-per-hour average speed, the northern round trip can be done in 4.5 hours, which would allow the crew to make 2 round trips in 9 hours. However, we cannot rely on all staffing needs to be handled out of Provo. If staffing is handled out of Salt Lake City, the round trip south to Moab will take 9.5 hours, and from Ogden, it would take over 10.5 hours. Realistically, car attendants and other onboard personnel would need to be hired from all across the state, which would lead to shifts beginning and ending along the entire network, and that would necessarily lead to some uncomfortably long shifts for daily employees. Having worked for 2 years in such a position myself, I can comfortably share that long, customer-facing positions of 10, 12, or even 16 hours in length are very possible, but only if space is given for employees to take breaks out of sight from needy passengers. Hence, my ideal train layout having the employee-only seating area in the baggage car, as I described earlier. This may all seem like I'm overanalyzing things, and perhaps I am, but the practicalities of round-trip operations are also directly tied to operational costs. Both of the Amtrak trains I mentioned at the beginning, the Pierre Marquette and the Vermonter, run trains only in one direction per day, requiring 2 train sets in order to make the round-trip schedule. This means that each train only brings in revenue from one load of passengers. Shorter routes, such as the Piedmonts or the Pacific Surfliners, run multiple trips with the same equipment and so are able to generate more revenue per train set, effectively lowering the overhead costs. If we want cheaper, more frequent trains here in Utah, we need to provide ways to maximize the use of each train set. Faster trip times are also an important tool for creating train set availability. If an hour really could be cut from the travel time by building new rails beside the upgraded US Highway 6, that would cut 2 hours from the round trip time, allowing trains to make perhaps even 2 round trips per day. This is one of the main considerations for operators of high-speed rail worldwide, except for China. Most dedicated high-speed rail lines are only made economical because the expensive train sets are able to make multiple round trips per day, and so offset their high costs via multiple train loads of paying passengers. But now I really am overanalyzing things. From a prospective passenger's point of view, travel times are only one factor among many. Taking the train means a safer, less stressful, and more comfortable travel experience than by bus, car, or air. Amenities such as our high-capacity baggage car, onboard food service, and restrooms cannot be easily replicated by road-based vehicles, while the superior ride quality of rail-based vehicles makes multitasking infinitely easier than in a small, bouncing, and leaning car. Flexibility in travel mode also allows more to be accomplished in less time. It should be possible to arrive from out of state at the Salt Lake City International Airport in the morning, enjoy lunch downtown, catch a train in the afternoon and enjoy dinner on board, walk just steps from your train to the national park in the evening, and then be at Delicate Arch by sunset, taking pictures in the golden hour as the colors change and the shadows stretch across the red rocks. Or, for locals, you could make a day trip out of it by boarding an early morning train, eating breakfast or lunch on board, having the afternoon to see the sights or hike or mountain bike in Moab, meet up for dinner on Main Street, and then take the evening train home again while you watch a movie or get some sleep. You never know what benefits you can unlock by building better connections between places, because what you're really doing is building better connections between people. I hope that one day soon, you and I can meet up on a train headed for adventure in eastern Utah and in Moab. Until then, stay tuned for the next video, when we'll tour the line from Provo south to Cedar City, and perhaps beyond. I'm Christian Lenhart. Thank you for watching.